Well, let's take a look here at 2 Samuel in chapter 16, the last paragraph going through chapter 17. We had a lot of tears this morning in our first service. Somehow, this is just a marvelous text. It's one of those stories that's not in your golden book of children's stories. It's one that you don't study all the time, about Ahithophel and Hushai. But it's got a lot to teach us, just like Kendall had us sing about the faithfulness of God. Corrie ten Boom said that one of the things that took her through the horror of the death camp was a lesson that her father, who was a Dutch watchmaker, taught her as a little girl. Corrie was asking him about certain things in life and about God and his will, and he just said to her, "Corrie, whenever we ride on the train, I don't give you your ticket." He said, "When do you give the conductor your ticket? When do I give you the ticket to give your conductor?" And she said, "It's just before we get off." And he said, "That's right. I give it to you when you need it, but it's always there." And he said, that's the way God is in life, that you'll wonder what he's doing and where he is, but he's right there. And he's seldom early, but he's never late. And he's going to take care of you, but he's going to do it when you need it. And what you have to do is ride on, and you have to trust him. She said that was good for a little girl, and it was good for a death camp. That when I need him, he's going to be there. And then he'll take me to the next spot, and then he'll pick me up. Then he'll take me to the next spot, and he'll pick me up. Well, that's what this text is about. David is resting at the Jordan River as Absalom enters into the city and takes over his kingdom. It's David's worst nightmare. He has lost his kingdom to a rogue son, and it looks bleak. But half of this chapter we're going to look at in chapter 17, 16 through 17, is going to be about Absalom and about God's protection of David from Absalom. David's not going to do a thing. God's name is not going to be mentioned. But God is going to be there indirectly working behind forces and taking care of David. And then the rest of the chapter of 17 is going to be not just protection, but provision. God is going to provide for David. God is going to guide him. God is going to care for him. And again, you won't see God, but you will see him using all things, as the psalm says. Thou hast made all things to be thy servants. And so this text is just great is thy faithfulness. When I have to have him, the God that took care of him from the mouth of the lion and the paw of the bear, from Goliath, from Saul, from the Amalekites, the Philistines, God is going to carry him through the later part of his life and look after him. This text is about providence, sovereignty, omnipotence, and the overarching care of God for his people, even when we can't see him. Do we need to know that sometimes? Like every day, that God is there with us, and he will be faithful. I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am, Paul said. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled, going hungry, having abundance, and suffering need. I can do all things, and here's the mystery, through Christ who strengthens me. He's there. Well, in verse, just stay with me here. Feel free to weep, okay? In verse 14, the king and all the people who were with him arrived, weary and refreshed himself. And Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem. And Ahithophel with him. The coast is now clear for Absalom. No one opposes him. He must be elated. He has done this within 4 years. It took David from his mid-teens until the time he was 37 to be in Jerusalem. For 7 years, he was in Hebron. It took him from mid-teens to 30 to be the king. It to be in Jerusalem, he was 37. It took him half his life if he started at 17. This kid is there in 4 years. He has not fired a shot. It looks so easy. Incidentally, Matthew Henry said, for God to raise up a great man, it takes an entire generation. It takes 17 years. He said, for God to raise up a cabbage, it doesn't take long. And that's what Absalom is, just a little fly-by-night. He comes very quickly. He doesn't have to go through giants and pursuing kings and wildernesses and things like this. God does not have to tear him down and build him up. He just takes a shortcut to the throne. And it looks like the world's way has worked well. In verse 16, it came about when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom. Now, if you'll put verse 15 there with it, Ahithophel is with him, and it came about when Hushai came to him. Here are two leading politicians, and they meet together. He must think now, I am sure of success. I have Ahithophel, and I have Hushai. Now, he has the Ark of the Covenant and the temple of the tabernacle of God, the tent of meeting, but he does not pray. Absalom never prays. He never consults the word of God. He has used God earlier. I'm about to celebrate a vow I made while I was in Hebron, so I need to go up and worship. He uses God as a ruse. He uses God for publicity. Can politicians ever do that? But he has no heart. Well, now he's where he wants to be, and so God, as a publicity agent, he needs him no longer. So he throws away all of his brochures. And now he's going to rely on his politicians and human wisdom. Can politicians ever do that? But he's going to find out that he's got some miserable politician counselors. Ahithophel is in darkness, and Hushai, by design, is not going to give him the truth. And so, in verse 17 through verse 19, Hushai gains access to Absalom through flattery. Hushai understands politicians. Absalom said to, verse 16. Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom. Hushai said to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. Absalom said to Hushai, is this your loyalty to your friend, meaning David? Why did you not go with your friend? Hushai said to Absalom, no, for whom the Lord, this people and the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and to him I will remain. Whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son, as I have served in your father's presence? So I will be in yours. He says, you're the king. God wants you to be the king. The people want you to be the king. Israel wants you to be the king. I serve with your daddy, and I'm going to serve with you. He flatters him. And Absalom bites. Ahithophel knows what this boy likes. And it's not God. It's his own ambition. And so he says, the Hebrew says, you the man. It doesn't really. But that's what he says. You the man. You're the top guy. And I'm with you. Matthew Henry wrote, how vulnerable men are to error who have gained their position through fleshly means. When you don't use wisdom to get where you are, you have an acquired immune deficiency syndrome. You have AIDS. You have nothing to fight error. And this boy doesn't. You know, my brother Bob, the one with the pooped out corpuscles, all right, that they're going to have to give him a bone marrow transplant. They were planning on doing that in a couple of weeks, and they said, we got to wait because they had to check his teeth. If you have, whenever they kill all of your immune system, if you have any infection in you, there's nothing standing in the way of it, and it will ravage your body. And so the place that it most gets started is teeth. And so they checked, and sure enough, Bobby's mouth was rotted out. Have y'all ever met my brother? I think he's over here, right? Somewhere. So I had to check his gingivitis and all that stuff. Half my family is really bad teeth. Half of us have good teeth. They checked him, and sure enough, he had some stuff that he didn't even know. It was just down there behind crowns and stuff, and they, opened him up and hosed him down and cleaned him out. And they said, yeah, you'd have been in a heap of trouble. Well, that's the way it is. Whenever you are have gained a position through false means, that you now are subject to any error that comes down the pike. And so Hushai looked at this fleshly boy and he said, this will be a piece of cake. You the man. Hello? He's got him. Just through praise. In verse 20, and Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your advice. Ahithophel is famous because of his success as a political Bernard Baruch, if you're old enough to remember him. He's a cabinet member to the kings, and he has been very successful because of his craft. But in verse 23, it was as if one inquired of the word of God. He's not that good. But men of the world are easily given this title of being final sources of truth because they're given it by an ignorant populace. Can a lot of times the mass of men elevate you beyond what you deserve? And they did. And so fame had swelled Ahithophel beyond what he deserved. Kind of like today. We want to know what the actor thinks, what the wealthy man thinks, what the model thinks on areas of wisdom and morality. What do you think? Because their success has swelled them beyond what they have a right to comment on. And also, those who excel in worldly wisdom, is it possible for them to be destitute in the things of God? It can be. Is it possible for someone who is great in worldly fame to even wreck their own lives and ruin their own lives through a lack of morality? Happens all the time. Authors, actors, politicians, athletes, scientists, philosophers, military men can wreck their lives because they believe their press. Y'all ever heard of Pete Rose or Roger Clemens or ad infinitum of guys that can do that? Well, in verse 21, here's his counsel. Go into your father's concubines, gracious, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you've made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of those who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Group sex on the top of a roof with everybody watching. Gracious. That's why you hadn't seen this in the Golden Book of Children's Stories. It's not on VeggieTales either. You're not going to get it. Did not Reuben do this in the book of Genesis? Go into Jacob's concubine? Because you would do this to gain position over the one in front of you that you had taken over. You'd take his wives. Reuben did that to his father's concubine, Jacob's. And Jacob said, as an oracle of God, you, Reuben, are preeminent in authority, first of my children. You will not have preeminence because you were uncontrolled as water and went up to your father's bed. You're fired. Did not Ahithophel know this? Leviticus 20, verse 11, you can't go into your father's wife. If your father has another wife, you've been widowed, has another wife, it's your stepmother. A guy in 1 Corinthians did this. Paul said, you've done something even the Corinthians won't do, even the pagans won't do. Now, does not this sage politician know this? He knows it. But as with sometimes guys in government that are divorced from God, honesty is not the best policy, it's pragmatics. Can that ever happen with politicians? That they forget what is right and only what is politically expedient. Not what is safe, but what is successful. And he knows that if you make yourself odious, it means that you have given an indication that you're going to rule all of David's. And that means that you promise now prosperity. All of this nation is about to be taken, and your followers can have it. So there is money to be made. If you follow after Absalom, there's a whole nation that's going to be yours. And it lets him know that we're not going back, that I have made myself odious. We will not be reconciled. Because all of a sudden, if we have a reconciliation between the two parties, now the people that have followed after Absalom are seen as persona non grata. And so by doing this, he offers prosperity and he offers security. That's what the politician offers without God. You can have security and you can have bounty. Well, Ahithophel knows what the public wants, and so he appeals to it, which is the fatal temptation of men of power that don't know God. I don't know if you remember Dr. Zhivago with Omar Sharif. Whenever the Russian Revolution took place, y'all remember that? Some of you old guys here, 1970? When the Russian Revolution took place and they overthrew the Romanovs that had ruled Russia for 300 years, and they instituted the most radical form of government ever imagined, communism. You remember what they did to the Romanov household? They killed them, they shot them. And when that happens in the movie, one of the characters says, why would they kill this man and his sons and those beautiful daughters that he had? Why would they kill them? And Omar Sharif said, to send a message to all of Russia, we're not going back, and there will be no peace. We have begun something that will never end. And so we send a message. I'm serious about this. Well, in verse 22, they pitched a tent. He goes into them because he considers in verse 23, this is wise advice. Godless men cannot winnow between wheat and chaff. They may be astute in areas of deception, astute in politics, and astute in crowd management. They may be astute in what would be called personal interest groups. But in the area of the holiness of God, they are less than Sunday school kids. They don't have a clue. Well, in chapter 17, moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me, and he gives him advice. And as soon as he gives advice, in verse 8, Hushai steps in, and he says in verse 7, this time the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good. Now, Absalom had bought in to Ahithophel's counsel. Do you know why? Because Absalom has itching ears. Like Paul said, the time will come when men will not follow sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears scratched, they will accumulate teachers to their own lust. They will surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear. And so when you've got a young man in rebellion against God, full of vengeance, and you say to him, I'm going to offer you sex and power and glory, do you think they'll take it? Absalom bit. But God knows all that's going to occur. Because you could go all the way back years earlier, 11 years earlier, when God said to David, you went into a woman in the dark. Someday they're going to go into your wives in the bright of day. Did it happen? It did. And so God is accomplishing his plans. And also in chapter 17, in verse 14, at the very end of it, the Lord had ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel that he might bring calamity on Absalom. God is the unseen shadow. He's not mentioned, but he keeps appearing. This happened because of 11 years previous. God said this, and he brings about his purposes to chasten David. God also is going to get rid of Absalom by his own sin. So God is behind this. And so though Ahithophel is acting, Absalom is acting, God is over like a marionette on the top of them. And he's bringing about his sovereign purposes. I asked Francis Schaeffer one time. I was at a Dallas conference that Francis Schaeffer spoke at, and he said, a guy asked him about the tension between sovereignty and free will. And Schaeffer said, I believe in a God that can let man do anything he wants to and leave nothing to chance. That you can have them both. You don't have free will and sovereignty. You have sovereignty and free will. And so man can act within the purposes of God and be held culpable, and God leave nothing to chance. God can have his cake and eat it too. And so God is in charge of everything. Is that good to know sometimes? When times are bleak and evil men are afoot and deception and perversion and rebellion and everything's coming around you, and God says, this happened because 11 years earlier I said this. And also, I'm going to take this boy down by his own actions. He is going to whittle the stick by which I shall thrash him. Well, did mom ever tell you that? Go out and get me a stick, huh? Yeah. 17:1. And so these two men will now give him plans. To make a long story short, Ahithophel will say this. Here's what you should do. Let me take a group of men, go out and get David, and we'll kill David. And thus all the rest of Israel will return to you, and you'll have unity of the whole nation. So he has caution towards Absalom getting killed. He asked him to have humility to let him go out. He asked him not to be vengeful toward everybody, but toward one guy. And he asked him to be reconciling to all the rest of Israel and bring all the nation back. And so he gave him counsel that had a sense of humility and wisdom and reconciliation to all the nation. Let's bring them back. And so he listens to it. Hushai knows the character of a young man. And Hushai, to thwart his counsel, says, here's what we'll do. You take all of the thousands of Israel with you, and you go with them and march at their head in glory. And you find your father and you kill him. And then you kill every other countryman that has followed after David. We'll never have to worry about them after this. And what's more, any town in Israel, as they flee for their lives, any town that gives them sanctuary, we will destroy it and drag it to the ground. And so there is might and fury and grandeur and glory and praise and honor. It's like in the movie where you, on the ring, where the guy gets the ring and evil sets in him. He offers him the ring. Now, without looking, what counsel do you think a young man would take? A young sinful man? Be humble, let another go, and be reconciliatory? Or you go in might and splendor and pageantry? That's what I want. And so he forsook Ahithophel, and he went with Hushai. And it states in 17 verse 14 that this was all God was behind it. The snare is set because God is sovereign and he will use man's own sinful will to bring about his purposes. He will use Absalom's success to make him blind to what is happening. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. When God can animate the entire creation and even your own emotions to act in contradiction to you. If you were making a movie about this, you would have to use some kind of computer-generated imagery that whenever he chooses against God, whenever he chooses violence and murder and rebellion, it's like the entire creation, you would represent it as becoming animated, coming to life. And it will all now be going against him. His emotions will go against him. Providence will go against him. Accidental events will go against him. It's almost like the tree's roots go out and start circling around him. He doesn't even know it. It's kind of like whenever Jonah rebelled against God and the sun was against him, which is always a problem. The wind was against him. The waves were against him. The fish were against him. The casting of lots was against him. The gourd was against him. The worm. You ever had a mad worm go after you? The worm, the whale, the worm, the gourd, the sun, everything. He can't win. God controls the winds and the waves. And so if you were someone that came to church because somebody drug you here and you're living in opposition to God and his revealed will, all things are against you. Every institution will be against you. And God will use your own actions to come back on you and to reprove you. But whenever a man is in submission to God, as David rests, it's like everything marshals as God's army to care for him. It's kind of like when Israel was in Egypt and all of the Egyptian gods turned on them. The Red Sea, frogs, lice, the sun, everything turns on them and consumes the Egyptians. When you're with God, even the sea will open up and let you through it. So God is sovereign. That's the way I feel about it, you know. That's the way life is. That was perfect, you know. Well, that cry said, I am frustrated. In verse 15, are you with me so far? So far, we have seen nothing of David. We have seen everything of Absalom. And what have you seen? That God has set the snare, and this boy is about to be consumed by his own activity. Protection. But in verse 15, we're about to see provision. Can God take care of a man who has nothing but a prayer? In verse 15, Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, this is what Ahithophel counseled Absalom and the elders of Israel. In other words, he's coming after you. And this is what I have counseled. Therefore, send quickly and tell David, do not spend the night at the forge of the wilderness. David's waiting at the forge of the wilderness. Hushai is going to send him word as to what he should do. Should I come on back into the city? Have you brought reconciliation? And all of a sudden, it's a bad note. He says, take off, get out, get away from here. In verse 16, do not spend the night at the forge of the wilderness. By all means, cross over, or else the king and all the people who are with him will be destroyed. Run. Now, Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. They are the two sons of Zadok and Abiathar. And a maidservant would go and tell them. Now, what you're going to see here are the people who are with David. The King James says, a wench. I like that. A wench, it means a young girl. A young girl would go and tell them. In the middle of a rebellious city that is going after Absalom, there is a young girl. She's in the city because her parents didn't follow after David, apparently. But this young girl has a mind of her own. She doesn't go with the populace of Israel after Absalom. This young teenage girl follows solitarily after her good shepherd. How many of y'all have teenage daughters. This is a great text. Even when the whole nation goes after a false shepherd, you, darling, can be faithful where you are. Amen? Even if everybody goes, you be faithful where you are, and you stand with the king. And so she puts her life on the line. She would go and tell them, and they would go tell King David, for they could not be seen entering a city. You know, it's a terrible thing whenever the priesthood has to hide out of fear. When the faithful of God have to run and hide and dwell in, like Hebrews says, in caves and holes in the ground. Are there places in our world today where the faithful of God are having to meet incognito? And they are horrors. Could that ever happen in our country where the faithful are continually put in a position of self-defense? It could. It's a terrible place to be. And so they would hide. And in verse 18, a young boy, he did see them and he told Absalom. Isn't it interesting that a young teenager, probably, a young boy, when faced with loyalty to an older man who is the Rose of Sharon, or a young guy who has great hair, a snazzy wardrobe, and a great ride. He's got a chariot. If I'm facing a guy he's got youth and looks and power, and he hadn't done anything, but he makes a lot of noise, that the young teenage boy will go after him. Can that ever happen? Well, he told Absalom, and the two of them, and incidentally, the girl doesn't follow after idiot youths either, all right? She lets the stupid boy go his own way, and she follows after God. Write that down. In blood. In verse 18, he departed. The two of them quickly departed and came to the house of a man in Bahurim. And in verse 19, he's got a woman. We've seen a faithful young girl. We've seen two faithful priests. We've seen two faithful sons of priests that are loyal and are runners. And now we see a middle-aged couple, a Priscilla and Aquila of the Old Testament. And this couple will not follow the way of the world. And incidentally, in the Old Testament, or New Testament, did Priscilla and Aquila, that are essentially the only couple represented in the New Testament with any great length, Joseph and Mary, you see Mary, you don't see a whole lot of Joseph. Ananias and Sapphira didn't do real well. But Priscilla and Aquila, Priscilla means the wise woman. Aquila means the eagle. They get a lot of press. Did they have to take care of somebody that had gotten run out of Rome? Or rather, they got run out of Rome. Did they have to take somebody that had gotten run out of an earlier place? Paul. And so it's interesting when you look at this great couple that they stand in distinction to all the other couples. That I'll take the one whom the multitude hates, and I'll take care of him, and I will love him over my own life. Is that preach material right there? In verse 19, it says in 18, they went down into the well, and in verse 19, she took a covering and spread over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it so that nothing was known. There possibly is an allusion to something here. The nation has stood against the very people of God, and the people of God now have to hide like they were enemies, like David did in his day from Saul. And where they hide is in the well that is covered with grain. The greatest blessings of God to Israel were the springs and the bounty. And here, the people that are persecuted are the people who are in that spot. The reason that Israel has been blessed with springs and with bounty is because of the God of the very people who have been rejected. That's a message I'm going to give to Congress as soon as I get invited. Don't stand against the people of God, because they're the very reason your country has anything that it has. And in verse 20, Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, and they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" And the woman said, "They've crossed the brook." Where else do you remember a woman in the Old Testament hiding spies and laying down her life? Rahab, the Egyptian midwives. And God blessed them both. Sometimes single girls and married couples in a turbulent day have to stand hard. Let me ask you, earlier in David's life, was there a time he had to hide from the powers that be? Yes. Then he established righteousness, and I'll be darned if we haven't returned to the former times. Is history that secure? It is not. It can turn on you at any point. Well, in verse 21, it came about after they had departed that they came up out of the well, and they told David and said to David, "Arise, cross the water quickly, for thus Ahithophel has counseled against you." And David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed the Jordan. You know, it's interesting, but here you're going to have the Davidic king go out of the eastern gate across the brook of Kidron, just like Christ, up the Mount of Olives, just like Christ, to Gethsemane. There he will weep in Gethsemane. Then he will cross the Jordan, and he will go among the Gentiles and the poor of Israel. And he will collect to himself the faithful of Israel, who, like the young wench, the young boy who is unfaithful, the young couple, and down in verse 27, a bunch of older faithful guys, the trial is going to separate the wheat from the chaff. The trial is going to winnow, and we're going to find out who's faithful and who is not. David will go away until God slays the false king, the anti-Messiah, or we could call him the what? Antichrist. God will slay him by the word of his mouth and bring him to an end. And then David will have a second coming, and he will come to the Mount of Olives like Christ. And there Israel will welcome him back, and in mercy he shall receive them. Do y'all know of another king who got rejected, went away to the Gentiles, and came back to establish his kingdom? It's an old motif. That's why when Christ began his life, Herod, the king of the Jews, sought his life, and he fled to Egypt until he was dead, and then he returned to establish his kingdom as the boy of Nazareth. Well, in verse 23, Ahithophel saw his counsel was not followed, and he saddled his donkey, and he arose and went to his home, to his city, set his house in order, and he strangled himself. He hung himself. Why did he do that? Because he recognized the cause is lost. God is against us. He's come to his wit's end. He said, "I have betrayed innocent blood," and he hangs himself. Did that ever happen again somewhere? Where a man from Judah said, "I have betrayed innocent blood," and he hung himself. Do y'all remember in the New Testament, the Jewish council got together as to what to do with the apostles who had been put in a prison, and the prison opened the door by itself and they walked out, which is always a problem. An angel let them out. And they were wondering what to do with these men. And a guy stood up named Gamaliel. And he said, "Men of Israel, listen to me. Remember earlier we had this guy rebel against us, and he had a bunch of people, and he got killed, and then they all dissipated and went to nothing. Then this guy raised up, and he got killed, and all his followers went to nothing. If these guys are not of God, they're going to fight with God, and God's going to remove them." But he said, "Be careful, because there's a lot of suspicious things happening with them. And if we fight against them and they're of God," he said, "you'll find yourself fighting against God. Don't you do it, because you're going to lose." They didn't take his counsel. 70 AD, they were destroyed. We're still here across the ocean. Ahithophel is like Gamaliel. If I have followed in opposition to the true Christ, I'm a dead man. Once I have started down that path, it will lead to brimstone. That's the wisdom he has to live with. And that's why when you see a young boy or a young girl that have set themselves in opposition against God and authority and parents and morality, you just say, God bless you. May he have mercy on you, because you have headed that way. It's a good lesson. The eye that mocks its father and curses its mother, the birds of the air will pluck it out. One time I was a chaplain at a Texas high school. There was a kid on that team that was a 3-year high school All-American. There's only been like 4 of them in Texas history. He was great. Signed with Southern Cal, that produces Heisman Trophy winners. And he was going to take the place of a guy named Ricky Bell that was the runner-up Heisman Trophy. Kid was about 6 foot, 5'11", 205. Man, could he play. And Southern Cal signed him. I asked his coach, I said, what do you think? Is this boy going to get the Heisman? And he looked at me and he said, he'll never carry the ball for Southern Cal. I said, how do you figure? And he told me a problem the boy had. The boy got kicked off Southern Cal. Then he went to a junior college and he got kicked off. Then he went to East Texas State and got kicked off. Then he went to SMU under Ron Meyer. Anybody here remember Ron Meyer? Satan could play under Ron Meyer. Ron Meyer kicked him off, which is like Hitler kicking you out for narrow-mindedness. All right. Ron Meyer, he got kicked out of 4 different programs. And today, God love him, he's a mess. What do you think his problem was? I said to the coach, what's his problem? He says he can't handle authority. Can't handle the law, his parents, his coaches, his teachers, anybody. And so he's not going to carry the ball. The eye that mocks its father and curses its mother, you're a dead man. And so he knows you oppose God. You've opposed all of life. Well, we conclude in verse 24, David came to Mahanaim. You know what Mahanaim is? Mahanaim is a place when Jacob was leaving Laban in Mesopotamia, coming back to the land of Canaan. He was going to have to face somebody, a great big hairy fellow that liked chili. Who are we talking about? Esau. And Jacob hadn't done much fighting in his life. He kind of likes cooking shows. And he's fighting this guy named Booger Red, all right? And Jacob is scared, and at Mahanaim, angels appear. And it's called the double camp, the Mahanaim. And God says, I'm with you. David comes to Mahanaim. And the God that had been faithful to the patriarchs. In Moses' day, did an angel appear to him in the burning bush and take care of him? And now the angels appear. And God just sends a message. He's at Mahanaim. God will give his angels charge concerning you, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And in verse 25, Absalom sets up, puts a guy in place called Amasa to take Joab's place. He pulls up in verse 24, Absalom crossed the Jordan. We're getting ready to have Manasseh 1, Bull Run of the Civil War. That's where the Civil War began. And we're about to have the sharpening of swords. Mahanaim versus just crossing the Jordan in Gilead. We're about to go at it. And the winner will take Jerusalem. Is that scary? You bet it is. Well, in verse 26, Israel and Absalom camped in Gilead. David came to Mahanaim, and look who's there. Has he prayed for provision? He hasn't, but God's heard his prayer even before he prayed it. Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Here's an Ammonite, a Gentile. Machir, son of Amiel from Lo-debar. This was the guy that took care of Mephibosheth whenever he fled for his life far north when David stepped into the throne and took care of him. He is a Jewish patriot who is red, white, and Jewish down to the core of his being. And he's going to do the right thing. And he is there. And then a guy named Barzillai of Gilead. Remember the Gileadites? The half-tribe of Manasseh? That Reuben, Gad, half-tribe of Manasseh stayed east of the Jordan because of the ranch land. This is a rich rancher. This is a guy from like Pecos, all right? And a Gentile and a Jewish patriot. So what do we have? We have a wench, a young girl. We have a couple. We have priest. We have sons of priests. And now we have 3 old men. And they are there. The young girl, she was broke. These guys are rich. God uses all kinds, all sexes, all ages, single and married, young and old, Gentile and Jew, and they all come together under God's working to take care of God's man. Well, it says they brought beds and basins and pottery and wheat and barley and flour and parched grain and beans and lentils and seeds. It's like a women's retreat, all right? And then here's the men's conference. Honey herds, sheep, cheese, yeah. For David and all the people to eat. For they said, the people are hungry. Every step along the way, good guys and evil guys like Ziba, holy and profane motives, to protect and to provide. Always indirect, you never see them, but God is pulling the strings. And right when you need it, God is there. Bill Bright used to talk about the adventure of serving Christ. You know, I can't imagine not being a Christian because life is so boring. But in serving Christ, it is a venir, to go, to go out. An adventure is you go out like a knight in armor. It's exciting. You don't know what's going to happen. This is the adventure of serving Christ, of God taking care of you. I remember as a young guy, I lived in a place that cost like $90 a month. You know this was a great pad to stay in. And my part of the rent was like $41.25. I had a chance to work over at Morrison's Mill hauling stuff or to go speak at this church out west of town. And I said, God, I'm going to trust you. I don't know how, but I'm going to trust you. And I went and spoke. And I spoke that morning. And this old guy, God got up and he said, man, Brother Tommy, that was real good. We think you should come speak this evening. Well, he didn't know. I was Barney Fife. I had 1 bullet. And I shot it that morning. Would you come back and preach? And I said, I sure would. Just give me a little time. Find a message writer. And so I did. And they took a thing called a love offering. And I remember they counted it out to me. $40, $41, and a quarter. Thank you, Tom. It was $41.25. Just what I needed. You know, God has done that ever since. It is the adventure of God just coming right when you need him and taking you along. We're going to have communion here. Just a second, but I got to tell you this. Back in 1978, remember Dan Green? Remember? Now a professor at Moody. He preached, and he got up, and he shared a story, and it was a story so good that 10 minutes after the story, the whole world was preaching it, and you couldn't share it anymore. And I never got to share it, but it was a great story. It was from a poem written in 1936. It was rewritten in 63, rewritten in 64, and now it's been decoupaged in every Cracker Barrel in the country. Most of you have got it in your bathroom. It's called Footprints in the Sand. Well, he read it for the first time. No one had ever heard it. And he read it. And I remember when he read it, everybody just teared up, and I thought, darn, I wish I'd read that first. I hadn't read this poem in all my years, but it had a profound truth. It hadn't been read in a long time, so maybe you go to IHOP or someplace like that. One night I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord. Many scenes from my life flashed across the sky, and in each scene I noticed footprints in the sand. Sometimes there were two sets of footprints, other times there was one only. And this bothered me because I noticed that during the low periods of my life when I was suffering from anguish and sorrow or defeat, I could see only one set of footprints. So I said to the Lord, you promised me, Lord, that if I followed you, you would walk with me always. But I have noticed that during the most trying periods of my life, there's only been one set of footprints in the sand. Why, when I needed you most, have you not been there for me? The Lord replied, the years when you have seen only one set of footprints, my child, is when I carried you. And you know that's true. In the hardest times of my life, God was there through every means to take me through it. Pray with me, you men that are going to help us with communion. Father in heaven, for just a few minutes, we'll stop. And we'll think about Passover when you took care of Israel. We'll think of the wilderness when you took care of Israel. We'll think of the conquest when you took care of Israel. And their times of sin and the judges when you took care of Israel. When they forsook you and you raised up a king and you took care of Israel. When they sinned against you and they went into captivity, and in captivity you took care of Israel and you brought them back. And the Persians opposed you, but you took care of Israel, and you built that temple. And the Greeks opposed you, but you took care of Israel. And the Romans opposed you, but you took care of Israel. And you gave your son, and Herod wanted him dead, but you took care of Israel. And you brought him back to Nazareth. And then they raised up against him, and they killed him, but you took care of your people. And you took care of the plan from the foundation of the world for us. And you raised him from the dead. And then you took care of Peter, and you took care of the 12, and you took care of Paul, and you took care of Stephen. You took care of Timothy and Titus and Philemon. And you took care of Augustine. You took care of Gregory. You took care of Wesley and Calvin. You took care of Luther. And you've taken care of your people throughout history, and you'll take care of us. And will remember. Amen.